Transracial. Whenever you hear that term, it usually comes from someone who doesn't understand what it actually means to be transgender. If a man can be a woman, then why can't a black person identify as a white person? They miss the point entirely. However, despite that, I don't believe that they are necessarily wrong. Hear me out real quick. It'll make sense in just a minute. If you apply the same principles of what it means to be transgender, then logically speaking, they are both just as applicable. Thus, if you accept one or reject one, you have to do so with the other. In order to prove this, we need to cover exactly what it means to be transgender. That is, you can identify as a different gender than your biological sex. This can happen because gender is a social construct. It is independent of your biological sex. If you're born a woman and you feel like a man, you have the same personality and a temperament as a man, you can be transgender. This is also coupled with gender dysphoria. You're born a certain biological sex, but you identify as a different gender because gender is a social construct. This is simple, right? And this is exactly true for transracial. Believe it or not, race is a social construct, at least according to sociologists. What is deemed white today wasn't yesterday. The Italians and Irish, they weren't seen as white, but they are today. Is it because there's something biologically different about them? Did they change in some sort of way? No, we just decided to say, hey, they're white now, because it's a social construct. Just like when one of the boys from the hood says, you're my N-word, you're a true N-word. In a sense, you're seen as black, you're seen as one of their group members, because it's a social construct. Kinda like with Biden, if you don't vote for him, you ain't black. In some instances, you're black. In some instances, you're not. It's a social construct. Now, I know those are comedic ways of wording this, but you get the point. They are social constructs at the end of the day, historically, and we can just see examples of it happening today, yet in a more lighthearted fashion. So if I want, I can be black if I so identify. If you take a black person, she's raised in a white family, in a white culture, she identifies with them as a whole. Who are you to tell her she is wrong? It's almost like saying this immigrant isn't a true American. The same thing is true for nationality. It's the exact same thing when you say a person can't identify with a certain race. Now, hey, you can. That's your choice. But you have to be consistent here. Who are you to say that a white woman raised in Japan is not Japanese, especially if she so decides? How can you say that if she's embraced that Japanese culture, lived with those Japanese people, is in essence Japanese? You can't say that she isn't. In one instance, people are allowed to identify with a social construct that is not directly connected to their biology. And in others, we tell them, no, you can't do that. It's wrong. It's not part of our ideology. Yet it's a blatant double standard. They are both just as applicable. Now, I can hear this coming already. Someone will say, well, transgender individuals, they have neurological differences in the brain. It's a real thing. It's connected to the biology because people who are transgender, let's say you have a transgender woman, they will have more feminine brains. Same for a transgender man. They will have more masculine brains. Yet in this instance that I'm talking about, trans race, that isn't happening. That is an interesting point, but ultimately it is irrelevant due to the fact that individuals who are not transgender exhibit the exact same brain structures and neurological patterns as the opposite sex commonly, despite not being transgender. You can have a man who has a more feminine brain. He's going to have a much stronger connection between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, yet he's not going to identify as a woman. He's simply going to be more feminine. And just because a man is more feminine, it doesn't make him a woman. Nobody believes that. The neurological patterns in the brain, there is nothing exclusive to them when it comes to being transgender. It happens commonly with people who aren't all the time. So what about them? Are we going to say that these people who are just more feminine in nature, you have a man, his brain is set up in a way that is much more feminine. Is he a woman? No, because according to your principles, he doesn't identify as a woman, so he isn't. And what about a woman who identifies as a man, but her brain structure isn't more masculine? Are you going to say, no, you can't identify as a man. You cannot be transgender. If that happened, would you gatekeep her and say, no, you can't do that? Of course not. You would say, well, she identifies as a man. She can do it. It's obviously the case because when a person identifies as transgender, last I checked, they don't force you to take a brain scan to determine if you're a man or a woman. It isn't a requirement. It's just you have a very strong urge, a very strong feeling, being gender dysphoria. And again, this breaks all of their principles if you were to adhere to this, because the underlying belief is your gender is not tied down by your biological sex. This would tie you down, and this would force other people who don't identify as the things they do, whether that be a man or a woman, to identify as the other. You're going to have feminine men who are forced to identify as women. They're not going to be happy with that. You're not going to be happy with the fact that they aren't happy with it either. And the same is exactly true for trans race. If you have an individual, if you have a person who says, I'm black, you have absolutely no right to say they are not black. You should just say, yes, you are black. You would be consistent in terms of your beliefs and your principles when it comes to people who are transgender. You can't just arbitrarily say, this one is true, but this one isn't. And you might say, well, it's not widely recognized by sociologists or psychologists. It isn't right now, but you cannot make that argument because going back in time just a few years ago, it wasn't the consensus then. So you have to pick. You pick both or leave both. It's just that simple. And that is the end of this video. Let me know what you think of the video. As for my personal thoughts on the matter, no, I don't think you can be a different race just because you say you are. And with that, you have to reject or accept both, as do I. Also, please follow me on Twitter. That would mean so much. Right now, I'm trying to reach out to people on Twitter. I'm trying to get some work when it comes to video editing, and having people who follow my account and like the videos I post, that would really help me to reach other people that I can work for. It would mean so much. Anyways, have a good one.